March 1941. Vallejo, California. The sun had barely risen over the misty waters of the Napa River, yet the shipyard was already alive. The rhythmic clang of steel against steel echoed like an industrial heartbeat across Mare Island Naval Shipyard. Sparks leapt from welding torches in a steady rhythm, showering the concrete floors with bursts of orange light. The air was thick with the smell of hot metal and salt, the kind of scent that clung to your clothes long after the shift was over. Inside the half-finished hull of a submarine, a man in a worn leather apron crouched over his workbench, wiping soot from his face. Edward Nelson, a welder earning $11 a day, squinted through the flicker of his torch, the flame reflecting in his goggles like twin suns. He was fast, precise, and dependable, everything a shipyard supervisor could want in an employee. But he was also restless. Each spark from his torch seemed to feed his frustration rather than his pride. Around him, men worked like clockwork, tightening bolts, lifting beams, drilling holes. Yet Nelson couldn't shake a single thought that looped endlessly in his mind. There has to be a better way. He paused for a moment, straightening his back and gazing upward at the endless maze of scaffolding above him. Dozens of men crowded the structure, twisting bolts and hammering planks onto steel frames that formed the submarine's deck. Beneath that deck, another crew worked upside down, using wrenches in spaces barely large enough to crawl through. For every section of wooden planking attached, it took hours of careful alignment, back and forth shouting, and aching precision. A single piece of deck might consume an entire day's work for a dozen men. Nelson shook his head, muttering to himself as his torch hissed to silence. The whole process felt backward, building the Navy's newest submarines using the same slow, exhausting methods they'd used for decades. America was racing against time, with war clouds gathering across the Pacific, and yet the shipyard's methods seemed frozen in the past. Each wasted hour, each missed deadline, could one day cost lives. He looked down at his notebook, the corners smudged with oil and fingerprints. Scrawled across the first page were the words he had written weeks ago: "This is madness." Beneath it, rough sketches, bolts, planks, weld points, and a crude drawing of an idea that had been haunting him for months. It was simple in theory: stop wasting time drilling and bolting from both sides. Instead, weld from one. It was a thought so clear, so obvious, that it almost angered him no one else could see it. For most of the men around him, the shipyard was a job. For Nelson, it was an unfinished puzzle. He'd spent nearly 15 years in machine shops up and down California, learning how metal behaved, how it bent, how it broke, how it could be shaped by patience and current. He wasn't a college engineer or a Navy officer. He was a working man with calloused hands and an imagination that refused to stay silent. The Navy demanded speed. Supervisors shouted orders. But beneath the noise, beneath the endless din of rivets and welds, Nelson could feel the shipyard straining against its own inefficiency. It wasn't sabotage or incompetence. It was inertia. Decades of tradition standing in the way of progress. As he watched a team of laborious struggle to align another deck plank, he could almost see the hours slipping away like sand through an hourglass. Each bolt, each nut tightened from below, was a symbol of how much time America didn't have. The nation wasn't at war yet, but every man on that island knew it was only a matter of time. The Pacific was stirring, and every submarine that failed to leave dry dock in time might one day mean the difference between victory and disaster. Nelson's gaze drifted to the massive shadow of a newly constructed submarine rising beside him, a steel beast resting on wooden blocks, its skeleton still open to the world. Dozens of workers moved across its surface, tightening bolts by hand, the sound echoing like a metronome of lost minutes. He clenched his jaw. The method wasn't just inefficient, it was absurd. Building scaffolding alone could take days, only to be torn down again once a section was complete. A process so tedious, it almost mocked the urgency of the world outside. That evening, as the whistle signaled the end of the shift, Nelson walked home in silence. The streets of Vallejo were filled with tired faces, men with rolled-up sleeves, women carrying groceries, children playing near the harbor. The smell of the sea mixed with the metallic scent of the yard. In his pocket, his notebook weighed heavy, not because of its size, but because of what it represented. Inside were ideas he couldn't ignore, sketches no one wanted to see. He sat at his kitchen table, flipping through the pages again. His wife, Emma, placed a cup of coffee beside him, watching him from across the room. "You're thinking about work again," she said softly. He didn't look up. "I just can't stop seeing how much time we waste," he murmured. "We build these ships like it's still 1918. Someone has to change it." Emma sighed, recognizing that tone, the one that meant her husband's mind had already set itself on something. The kind of thought that wouldn't let him rest until it was tested in metal and fire. Outside, the shipyard lights flickered against the evening fog, casting long reflections across the water. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the world was preparing for a storm. Nelson didn't know it yet, but his small notebook, the one filled with sketches and frustration, was about to ignite a revolution that would save millions of hours, countless lives, and forever change how America built its fleet. The next morning began like any other, the same shrill whistle, the same ocean wind sweeping through the yard, the same army of workers marching toward another 12-hour day. But for Nelson, everything felt different. He had crossed a silent line in his mind the night before. The thought that had once been just irritation had now hardened into resolve. If nobody else would fix this, he would. He spent the early hours watching the workflow, not as a participant but as an observer. Every clang, every shout, every wasted motion became a data point. He saw one crew assembling wooden scaffolds to reach the deck of a submarine while another crew waited idly below. Their work halted until the structure was complete. Hours would pass before they could even begin welding. The scaffolds would later be torn down and rebuilt for the next section, an endless cycle of construction just to build more construction. He knew the supervisors didn't see it. To them, inefficiency was invisible because it was normal. They had grown so used to the chaos that they no longer questioned it. The process was older than most of the men following it, and challenging it was almost heresy. The Navy had its rules, the contractors had their habits, and nobody wanted to risk being the one who did things differently. During the lunch break, Nelson walked past the loading docks, where trucks unloaded crates of rivets and bolts. He paused to watch a younger worker struggling to align a metal plate while another man held a wrench from below, shouting instructions. The whole operation required 3 people, and still the bolts misaligned. Nelson crouched beside them, offering quiet advice. "If you didn't have to reach under there," he said, tapping the plate with his gloved finger, "you could finish this in half the time." The younger man laughed, assuming it was just talk. But Nelson's eyes stayed on the metal, calculating, imagining. As he walked away, the sound of hammering grew distant, replaced by the rhythm of his own thoughts. What if there was a way to weld fasteners directly onto the surface, eliminating bolts altogether? A single gun, handheld, compact, portable, something any worker could operate without scaffolding or crawling into the dark underside of a ship. He had no design yet, but the idea was beginning to take shape, glowing like the first spark before a flame. Days passed, and the shipyard's monotony continued. Nelson kept his secret quietly, jotting notes whenever an idea struck him. He noticed how each stage of construction slowed because of access. Men waiting for cranes, cranes waiting for space, space waiting for supervisors. It wasn't lack of skill that made things slow. It was the system itself. A chain of waiting. That night, while others crowded the local bar, Nelson sat at his workbench at home, surrounded by scraps of metal and old parts salvaged from previous jobs. The single bulb above his head buzzed faintly as he flipped open his notebook again. He drew the outline of a tool, something that could combine heat and pressure to fuse metal pieces instantly. He scribbled arrows, notes, and formulas in the margins. The more he drew, the clearer the vision became, a device that could attach studs or bolts without drilling or threading, saving hours on every section of a ship. It wasn't just a dream, it was a necessity. America was on the edge of joining a war that would demand speed like never before. The British were struggling across the Atlantic, and the Pacific was growing tenser each month. Shipyards from Norfolk to San Diego were already at full capacity, yet production lagged behind schedule. The country needed something faster, something revolutionary, even if it came from a welder with a stubborn streak. But revolutions rarely begin with applause. The next week, Nelson decided to test the waters. He approached his supervisor, a broad-shouldered man named Frank Malley, whose grey hair and cigar gave him an air of permanent irritation. "Frank," Nelson began carefully, "I've been thinking about a way to make the deck attachments faster. What if we—" Malley interrupted before he could finish. "Ed, if you've got ideas, take them to the engineers. We build what we are told." Nelson tried again, explaining his concept in simple terms, how welding studs instead of bolting could save days of labor. Malley frowned, tapping ash from his cigar. "You trying to tell me the Navy's been doing it wrong all these years?" Nelson hesitated, sensing the skepticism tightening like a vice. "Not wrong," he said. "Just slower than it needs to be." Malloy chuckled, shaking his head. You're a welder, Ed. Not an inventor. Leave the thinking to the engineers. The conversation ended there, but the idea didn't. That night, Nelson walked home with his jaw clenched, his thoughts boiling. He knew Malloy wasn't trying to be cruel. He was just defending a system that had raised him, the same way most people did. But the exchange confirmed what Nelson already suspected. No one was going to help him. If he wanted to prove this could work, he would have to do it himself. In the days that followed, the shipyard seemed even louder, the inefficiency even more unbearable. Each clang of metal echoed like a challenge. He watched his co-workers wrestle with bolts and scaffolds, and the sight filled him with equal parts frustration and determination. It wasn't arrogance that drove him, it was logic. The numbers didn't lie. If a single submarine required tens of thousands of fasteners, and each one took several minutes to install manually, then one innovation could save weeks of time per vessel. Multiply that by hundreds of ships, and the savings weren't just hours, they were years. One evening, Nelson stood on the pier, watching a newly completed submarine slide into the water for its first test. The crowd cheered, but his eyes were elsewhere, on the workers packing up the scaffolding, on the piles of wasted wood and metal that would soon be thrown away. To him, the launch wasn't a celebration, it was a reminder. Every one of those bolts represented a minute lost forever. And time, he thought, was the one resource America could never afford to waste. As the submarine drifted into the open bay, he turned away, clutching his notebook tighter. The world was about to change, and when it did, his idea would no longer be just a theory in pencil and grease. It would be the spark that made steel move faster than anyone thought possible. Weeks passed, but Nelson's mind refused to rest. Every clang of metal around him felt like punctuation in a sentence only he could read, a story of inefficiency begging for a new ending. During breaks, while other welders smoked or swapped stories, he sat quietly, tracing lines on scraps of paper, sketching the same device from different angles. A welding gun that didn't just fuse metal, but also attached studs, quickly, precisely, permanently. At home, the sketches multiplied. His small garage became a laboratory of improvisation. Coffee cans filled with bolts, old car parts, bits of copper wire, and torch nozzles cluttered the bench. Emma watched him from the doorway most nights, shaking her head with a mixture of amusement and concern. "You'll burn through our savings before you burn through that metal," she joked gently. He didn't laugh. His eyes stayed fixed on the prototype, a mess of hoses and tubing connected to a small transformer he'd salvaged from a scrapyard. He wasn't sure what to call it yet, but he knew what it needed to do: deliver current strong enough to fuse a metal stud to steel instantly. No threads, no bolts, no wrenches. Just pressure and heat, fast enough to hold, strong enough to last. He envisioned shipbuilders carrying these devices by hand, moving freely across decks instead of crawling beneath them. A process that could cut man-hours by half, maybe more. The first attempt failed spectacularly. Sparks exploded, and a fuse popped, plunging the garage into darkness. Emma, startled, rushed in as Nelson sat on the floor, coughing through smoke. "It's fine," he said between breaths, waving his hand dismissively. "Just the current's too high." She sighed, opened the door to let in air, and muttered, maybe the Navy knew what they were doing after all. But her words only fueled him. Failure was feedback, and he learned fast. Every night, he adjusted wire lengths, coil configurations, and voltage regulators. He'd test, fail, adjust again. The garage began to smell permanently of ozone and scorched metal. His hands bore small burns and his clothes carried the faint pattern of sparks, but Nelson was closer each day. During his shifts at Mare Island, he quietly experimented with different welding rods and currents, pretending to fix small parts while mentally running calculations. One afternoon, as he was finishing a job, a fellow welder leaned over and said, "You look like you're building something that ain't on the blueprint." Nelson smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." It was late one Saturday when everything finally came together. The prototype, crude, heavy, and loud, sat on the bench before him. He took a deep breath, clamped a metal stud to a steel plate, and pressed the trigger. For a split second, there was silence. Then, a sharp flash, a sound like lightning striking close, and the stud was fused tight, perfectly flush with the surface. Nelson froze, eyes wide. He tapped the joint with his wrench. It didn't budge. He hit it harder. Still solid. He leaned back, a quiet laugh escaping his throat. "It works," he whispered. It wasn't elegant yet, the cables tangled, the housing awkward, but it worked. For the first time, a single man could attach a fastener to steel without drilling or threading, and it would hold strong enough to survive the ocean. The next morning, he brought the prototype to the shipyard, hidden in a canvas bag. He wasn't supposed to use unapproved tools, but rules had never stopped innovation before. When the foreman stepped away, Nelson positioned himself beside a test panel and fired the gun again. The result was identical, a perfect stud, fused instantly. A few nearby workers stopped to stare. "What the heck was that?" one asked. Nelson grinned. "A shortcut." Word spread quickly. Within days, half the yard was talking about the lightning gun Nelson had made. Some laughed it off as a parlor trick. Others whispered that it might actually change everything. But not everyone was amused. When the supervisors heard about the unauthorized experiment, Nelson was summoned to the main office. Malley was there, along with 2 engineers in crisp uniforms. The air smelled of tobacco and suspicion. "Ed," Malley began, "I hear you've been testing something on company time." Nelson didn't deny it. He placed the gun on the table between them and said, "I think this can save us weeks on every ship. Maybe months." One of the engineers examined it, unimpressed. "You're saying this thing can replace bolts?" "Yes," Nelson said simply. "And you don't need to drill. One man can do the job of 3. The second engineer leaned back, smirking. "That's not how shipbuilding works, son. You can't just change procedure because you found a faster way." Nelson's jaw tightened. "With respect, sir, the enemy won't wait for our procedures." The room went silent. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Malloy sighed. "Take your tool home, Ed. We can't authorize this. Not now." He picked up his gun, nodded silently, and walked out. The rejection stung, but beneath the frustration was a spark of something stronger, conviction. The men in that office didn't see it yet, but they would. The tool worked, and once the world needed speed more than protocol, it would come knocking. That evening, back in his garage, Nelson stared at his creation resting on the bench. Its surface was scorched, wires frayed, casing scratched. It was far from perfect, but it was real. He switched off the lights, the faint glow of molten steel still fresh in his memory. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a smile. He didn't know it yet, but the simple act of pressing that trigger had just changed the future of shipbuilding, and soon, the entire war industry. The invention no one wanted would become the machine no nation could win without. The next few weeks were a test of patience and pride. Nelson returned to work as if nothing had happened, welding plates and beams alongside men who now looked at him differently. Some treated him with quiet respect, whispering that his tool might be onto something. Others avoided eye contact, afraid to be seen talking with the guy who had challenged the system. In a place like Mare Island, reputation traveled faster than smoke. One afternoon, as he was grinding a seam near the submarine's hull, Malley approached him again. His tone was measured, almost apologetic. "Ed, you're a good worker. One of the best. But you can't keep pulling stunts like that. The Navy has rules for a reason." Nelson nodded, though his expression stayed distant. "The rules don't build ships, Frank. People do. And right now, people are wasting half their time tightening bolts." Malloy sighed, glancing toward the massive frame of the submarine under construction. "You think you're the first one to come up with an idea? Every guy here has a theory. But the Navy doesn't run on theories, it runs on what's proven." That word stuck in Nelson's mind. Proven. They wanted proof. And proof, he decided, was exactly what he would give them. He spent nights refining the design, reshaping the handle, tightening the wiring, stabilizing the voltage. He learned from electricians, borrowed equipment from friends, even studied blueprints from the public library to understand circuit behavior. Each improvement made the gun sleeker, more reliable, more portable. He began recording his test results meticulously, keeping notes on temperature, strength, and weld quality. It wasn't just a hobby anymore. It was data, the language of proof. By late summer, he had a working model that looked less like a homemade contraption and more like a legitimate industrial tool. He called it the Stud Welder, a name so plain it almost hid its brilliance. With it, he could weld dozens of fasteners in the time it took to drill one hole. Every test confirmed what his instincts already knew. It worked flawlessly. He requested another meeting, this time not with Malley, but directly with the Navy's engineering division. To his surprise, they agreed to see him. Dressed in his only suit, with a device tucked carefully in a wooden box, he walked into the whitewashed office building that loomed near the docks. The air inside smelled of ink and oil. A row of officers in pressed uniforms waited behind a long oak table. Nelson placed the box on the table, opened it, and spoke with calm precision. "Gentlemen, this device can attach studs to steel instantly, without drilling or threading. It can cut hours off every section of ship construction. I can demonstrate it right now." An officer leaned forward, curious but cautious. "What kind of current does it use?" Nelson explained, describing the short burst of electrical energy that fused metal under pressure. He spoke their language: voltage, resistance, tensile strength, terms he had learned by studying after long shifts. Another officer interrupted. "And you built this yourself?" "Yes, sir. In my garage." That answer seemed to change the mood. The officers exchanged glances. The curiosity vanished, replaced by polite smiles. The man in the center, whose insignia gleamed under the fluorescent lights, finally spoke. "Mr. Nelson, innovation is admirable. But our procedures are designed for safety, not shortcuts. Welding fasteners this way could compromise structural integrity. We can't take that risk." Nelson tried to interject. "Sir, I've tested the joints myself. They're stronger than bolts." But the officer raised a hand. "We appreciate your initiative. The Navy will contact you if it finds your method useful." The meeting was over. He left the office in silence, walking past rows of gleaming ships still under construction, monuments to the very inefficiency he was trying to fix. Each clang of metal echoed the same message. The system had no room for innovation that didn't come stamped with official approval. That evening, he sat in his kitchen, staring at the rejection letter he'd received on the way out. It was brief and bureaucratic. The kind of language that disguised dismissal as politeness. Emma read it over his shoulder. "They said no." He nodded. "They said it's too risky. Too untested." She rested a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe they're right, Ed. Maybe it's just not the right time." He didn't answer. Instead, he looked out the window toward the distant glow of the shipyard, where cranes moved like giant shadows against the night sky. "They'll change their minds," he said quietly. "One day they won't have time to say no." In the months that followed, the world began to shift. The news grew darker. Europe burned. The Pacific grew restless. And then, one December morning, the headlines screamed of an attack that shook the nation. Pearl Harbor. Everything changed overnight. Factories that once built cars now built tanks. Shipyards ran 24 hours a day. Suddenly, speed wasn't a luxury, it was survival. The same Navy that had dismissed Nelson's idea now faced an impossible race against time. At Mare Island, the workers doubled their shifts. The air was filled with urgency, the kind that left no room for doubt. Ships had to move, no matter the cost. Nelson returned to his station with a strange mix of determination and quiet satisfaction. The system that had rejected him was now desperate for the very thing he'd been offering all along, a way to work faster. And while most saw the chaos as crisis, he saw something else entirely: opportunity. The kind that only appears once in a generation, when necessity forces the world to listen to ideas it once ignored. That night, as the nation held its breath, Nelson walked into his garage and stared at the stud welder resting on his bench. The hum of the transformer still lingered in the air, a low, steady promise. He placed his hand on the device and whispered to himself, "Now they'll have to see." What he didn't know was that in less than a year, his rejected invention would become one of the most essential tools of the war, the silent engine behind a fleet that would turn the tide of history. The transformation began quietly. What started as one man's defiance soon became the hidden heartbeat of wartime innovation. The attack on Pearl Harbor had shaken every industry awake, and Mare Island was suddenly operating under lights that never went out. The clang of hammers no longer stopped with the sunset. The night now belonged to welders, machinists, and engineers who worked until their hands trembled. For Nelson, it was the moment he'd been waiting for. He knew the Navy would need faster methods to keep up with demand. Within days of the attack, government inspectors began flooding the shipyards, searching for anything that could accelerate production. But bureaucracy still moved slower than the war itself. So Nelson decided to move without it. He approached his friend, Joe Ramirez, a foreman on the auxiliary ship line. Joe was skeptical at first, He'd heard the stories about Nelson's magic gun. But desperation changes minds faster than persuasion ever could. You're telling me this thing can cut our fitting time in half? Joe asked, raising an eyebrow. Nelson smiled faintly. Not half. Closer to 2/3. Joe scratched his chin. You're crazy, Ed. But at this point, crazy might be what we need. That night, under the floodlights of the assembly bay, Nelson and Joe ran their first unofficial trial. With 2 trusted welders standing watch, they tested the stud gun on the hull of an auxiliary vessel scheduled for inspection. The machine hummed to life with its familiar electrical growl. Sparks erupted, short, clean, efficient, and within minutes, 20 studs were in place.
No drilling, no scaffolding,
no waiting. Joe's eyes widened as he tested the attachments with his wrench. They're solid, he said, almost in disbelief. These would pass inspection easy. Nelson grinned. Then let's not tell anyone until it's done. By dawn, half the lower deck was completed, work that normally took 2 full shifts. When the inspectors arrived later that day, they were astonished at the progress. You boys working double time? One asked. Joe shrugged innocently. Just working smarter. The test was a success, but it couldn't stay secret forever. Word spread through the yard like a spark through dry timber. Soon, supervisors began asking questions. Nelson braced himself for another reprimand, but this time, things went differently. The yard's chief engineer, Commander Allen, requested a private demonstration. Allen was a practical man, known for his icy calm and ruthless efficiency. When Nelson showed him the gun, explaining the principles behind it, Allen listened silently, his arms crossed. After a long pause, he gestured to a steel plate nearby. Show me. Nelson clamped the stud, pressed the trigger, and the gun fired its clean flash. The stud fused instantly. Allen walked forward, tapped it with a wrench, and gave it a sharp twist. It didn't move. He turned to Nelson. How many of these can you make? Nelson blinked, unsure whether he'd heard correctly. Sir. I said, how many units can you produce if we give you materials? Nelson hesitated. A few at first. But if I can get proper equipment, maybe dozens.
Allen nodded slowly.
You'll have what you need. Report to the design office tomorrow morning. That night, Nelson barely slept. The war had turned the tables faster than he could have dreamed. The same Navy that once dismissed him was now asking for his help. For the first time, he felt the world shifting in his direction. Within weeks, he was transferred from the welding line to a small corner of the engineering division. Not an office, but a converted maintenance shed filled with cables, generators, and metal scraps. It wasn't glamorous, but to Nelson, it felt like a laboratory. He and a handful of machinists worked tirelessly to refine the design. They made the gun lighter, safer, and easier to handle. Each version improved on the last. By February 1942, the device could weld over 100 studs per hour without a single misfire. The Navy's production command took notice. Nelson was invited to demonstrate the device at a regional conference in San Francisco, attended by representatives from shipyards up and down the coast. It was his first real audience, and his biggest risk. Standing before a crowd of officers and engineers, Nelson felt the weight of every failure, every dismissal. But as he connected the cables and prepared the gun, his nerves vanished. He pulled the trigger once. The spark flashed. The metal fused. Then silence, the kind that follows when disbelief meets reality. An admiral in the front row leaned forward. That took less than a second, he said. Nelson nodded. Yes, sir. And it'll hold longer than any bolt you've ever used. The demonstration ended in applause, restrained at first, then louder as the implications sank in. The Navy's procurement officers approached him afterward with urgent expressions. We'll need these in every major shipyard within the year, one said. Nelson's life changed overnight. What had once been an unauthorized experiment was now a classified project. He was given a small team, a budget, and the government's backing to mass-produce the welding guns. His invention was no longer his secret. It was now a weapon of efficiency, one that could change the entire face of American industry. But success brought its own challenges. With rapid expansion came scrutiny. Contractors wanted control, engineers wanted credit, and bureaucrats wanted paperwork. Nelson wasn't interested in politics. He just wanted results. Yet as he watched the first production models roll off the line, he couldn't help but feel both pride and unease. His creation was no longer his alone. It belonged to the war now. Standing on the dock one evening, he watched a newly finished destroyer glide into the bay. Its hull, assembled in record time, gleamed under the setting sun. The sound of distant welding guns echoed across the yard. His guns, operated by hundreds of workers who didn't even know his name. Emma joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the sea breeze. "You did it, Ed," she said softly. "They're using your machine." He nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Yeah," he said quietly. "But now it's not mine anymore." She smiled faintly. "Maybe that's how progress works." He didn't reply. The sea shimmered with light. The ships lined up like sentinels ready for a war that was only just beginning. For the first time in years, Nelson allowed himself to feel something close to peace. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning, because once a machine changes the way people build, it never stops changing the people themselves. By the spring of 1942, the quiet hum of Nelson's small workshop had turned into a roar. Orders flooded in faster than he could process them. Factories from San Francisco to Richmond were calling, desperate to get their hands on the Nelson gun, as workers had started to call it. Even the name, short, sharp, easy to remember, seemed built for war. The Navy's Bureau of Ships sent him blueprints for immediate adaptation into large-scale use. Every week, new requests arrived: guns for submarine decks, fittings for carriers, attachment points for armor plates. Nelson's invention had gone from a dismissed idea to a cornerstone of wartime production in less than 6 months. But success came with chaos. The once simple act of welding studs now required whole departments to manage production, testing, and training. The Mare Island shipyard expanded its operations, assigning teams of welders to learn the new method. By summer, entire classes of workers, many of them new recruits with no previous welding experience, were operating Nelson guns daily. In a training yard filled with the constant crack of electricity, an instructor shouted over the noise, "1 pull, 1 second, 1 stud. Don't overthink it." Rows of men and women followed, sparks flashing in perfect rhythm like a symphony of efficiency. It was beautiful in its precision, and terrifying in its scale. Nelson watched one of these sessions quietly from a distance. It was everything he dreamed of, and yet he couldn't shake a sense of unease. His invention had been born from frustration, a craftsman's need to make work smarter, not harder. But now it was part of a machine so vast that individual thought barely mattered. His design wasn't a tool anymore. It was a process, an industrial heartbeat driving thousands of hands. Still, the results spoke for themselves. In the first quarter of 1942 alone, shipyards reported a 40% reduction in deck installation time. Some facilities even claimed to complete certain sections in a third of the usual schedule. What once took 6 days could now be done in 1. Word spread fast. Kaiser's Liberty Ship Program, a massive effort to build cargo vessels in record numbers, adopted the system almost immediately. At the Richmond shipyard, where production was measured not in weeks but in hours, the Nelson gun became indispensable. "We used to measure progress in bolts," one foreman joked. "Now we measure it in sparks." Soon, reporters began taking notice. An article in the San Francisco Chronicle called it the welding revolution, describing how a small California workshop had reshaped the face of American shipbuilding. Nelson's name appeared briefly in print, though he barely had time to read it. Between production meetings, material shortages, and Navy inspections, his days blurred into one long pulse of motion. The company he'd built in his garage was now a factory employing dozens: machinists, electricians, bookkeepers, and secretaries. His nights were spent drafting new patents and answering telegrams from Washington. He had stepped into a world of numbers and signatures, far from the sparks that had once defined his work. But not everyone celebrated his success. A growing tension brewed between innovation and oversight. The Navy wanted results, but it also wanted control. Committees were formed, reports demanded, audits conducted. Engineers he had never met now claimed ownership over improvements to his design. One afternoon, while reviewing production orders, Nelson was visited by a representative from the Bureau of Ships. The man, polished and efficient, laid out a stack of papers on the table. "Mr. Nelson, we'll be integrating your process under Navy supervision moving forward. You'll continue manufacturing, but all technical rights will be held by the government during wartime." Nelson stared at the papers. "You're taking my patent." Not taking, the man corrected smoothly. Requisitioning. For national defense. It's standard procedure. For a long moment, Nelson said nothing. He knew fighting the government was pointless, and besides, there were ships to build. Still, it hurt to see his life's work reduced to a clause in a contract. After the man left, he sat alone at his desk, the hum of the factory outside fading into silence. Emma found him there hours later. "You look like you just lost something," she said gently. He smiled faintly. "Maybe I did. But if it gets the job done faster, maybe it's worth it." By late 1942, the numbers were staggering. Shipyards across the United States had installed millions of welded studs. Construction time for submarines dropped dramatically. The USS Cod, the USS Finback, and the USS Bowfin, all built using Nelson's process, were completed ahead of schedule and sent to the Pacific in record time. Every gun, every stud, every spark now carried his unseen signature. And with each passing month, the war machine grew faster, louder, more unstoppable. But success had a shadow. The more efficient the system became, the less human it felt. Workers who once took pride in their craft were now part of an endless assembly line. Mistakes were unforgiving, pressure relentless. Some nights, Nelson stood at the edge of his factory floor and wondered if he had created progress, or just perfected exhaustion. The paradox haunted him. His invention had given people a faster way to work, but it had also made the work never-ending. As soon as one task finished, 10 more appeared. War didn't rest, and neither could those feeding its hunger. Still, the urgency of victory drowned every doubt. When a reporter asked him how it felt to know his invention was changing history, Nelson gave a quiet, measured answer. "It feels like we are racing the clock. I just hope we win before it stops ticking." He didn't know then how close that race really was, or how his next decision would test everything he believed about invention, recognition, and what it truly meant to serve. By the end of 1942, Ted Nelson's name had traveled far beyond California. What had begun as one man's stubborn dream had turned into a quiet industrial revolution. His invention was now the backbone of naval construction across the United States. Shipyards from Maine to San Diego were welding studs faster than bolts could ever be tightened, building ships at a pace that defied belief. Yet, while his creation spread like wildfire, Nelson himself remained a ghost in the system he had built. The Bureau of Ships now referred to his method simply as Approved Welding Process Number 4B. The Navy's internal memos rarely mentioned his name. His factory was busier than ever, working 3 shifts a day, but the credit had already begun to drift toward departments, not people. He received his first official recognition in November 1942, a formal visit from a group of officers wearing crisp uniforms and practiced smiles. They arrived unannounced at his San Leandro facility, where sparks flew in every direction and the smell of hot metal filled the air. The lead officer, Captain Harrison, greeted him with a firm handshake. "Mr. Nelson, I'm here on behalf of the Secretary of the Navy," he said. "We've completed our evaluation of your process. It has saved the Navy over 5 million man-hours in ship construction this year alone." For a moment, Nelson couldn't speak. 5 million. The number sounded unreal. Harrison continued, "You've helped us put ships in the water faster than any other industrial innovation in naval history. On behalf of the United States government, I'm authorized to present you with a citation for exceptional contribution to the war effort." Applause echoed through the workshop. Workers paused, wiping sweat and soot from their faces to watch their boss, the same man who had once welded beside them, shake hands with Navy officers. Nelson smiled, thanked them, and posed for a photograph he would later keep in his office drawer. The ceremony lasted less than 15 minutes, but it marked a turning point. That night, after the officers left and the factory quieted, Nelson sat alone among the silent machines. The plaque gleamed in the light of a single overhead lamp. He should have felt proud, vindicated, even. But instead, a strange heaviness settled in his chest. He had fought so hard to be heard, to prove that his idea worked. Now that it had, it no longer felt like his. A few days later, Captain Harrison returned privately. His tone was softer this time, less ceremonial. "I've read your file, Mr. Nelson," he said. "You submitted this idea to Mare Island before the war. It should have been evaluated properly. It wasn't. That was a mistake, and I apologize for it." Nelson didn't know how to respond. The apology was genuine, but late. Harrison went on, "You need to understand something. The reason your idea succeeded wasn't because of approval, it was because you didn't wait for it. The Navy moves on procedure. You moved on instinct. That's the only reason we have this process now. It was the first time anyone from the establishment had admitted that bureaucracy had failed him, and it gave him both comfort and frustration. Sometimes, Harrison said, the best way to serve your country is to ignore the manual. In the months that followed, Nelson's company expanded again. Orders came not just from naval shipyards, but from private manufacturers, bridge builders, and contractors involved in the Liberty and Victory ship programs. By early 1943, his factory employed over 200 people. Most were new to welding. Many were women who had never held a tool before the war. Nelson made a point to train them personally. He believed in hands-on learning, that innovation wasn't about theory, but practice. "Don't fear the spark," he told a young woman one morning as she hesitated with the gun. "That's just metal telling you it's ready to change." Under his leadership, efficiency soared. Submarines that had taken 7 months to build were now completed in 5. Carriers that once needed a small army of workers could now be assembled by half that number. Every welded stud represented minutes saved, and multiplied across thousands of ships. Those minutes became months, even years. The Navy's estimates soon turned astonishing. By late 1943, Nelson's process was credited with saving an accumulated total of 50 million man-hours, more than 5,000 human years of labor. His equipment had become as essential to naval construction as the rivet gun once was to aviation. But recognition brought new forms of pressure. Representatives from competing firms began appearing at his door, offering to help with scaling his technology. Large industrial companies, seeing the government's enthusiasm, wanted to absorb his business. Some made generous offers, too generous to be friendly. Others hinted at what would happen if he refused. Emma worried constantly. "They're circling you, Ed," she said one night as they went over paperwork at the kitchen table. "You should sell the company before they take it from you." He shook his head. "No, this isn't just a company anymore. It's proof that a worker's idea can change the world. I can't hand that over to people who see it as just another contract." Still, the pressure grew. The more successful the process became, the more invisible its creator seemed. Articles referred to naval engineers or technical teams, rarely mentioning the man who had started it all in his garage. Nelson didn't chase publicity. He had never cared much for speeches or awards, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that history was already being rewritten without him. By 1944, his company had earned 2 Army-Navy E awards for excellence in production, one of the highest honors a wartime manufacturer could receive. At the ceremony, hundreds of workers stood shoulder to shoulder as a military band played. Flags fluttered, officers saluted, and the factory floor erupted in cheers when Nelson stepped up to the microphone. He looked out at the faces before him, men and women from every background, hands marked with the burns and stains of labor. "We didn't do this for medals," he said. "We did this because every ship finished faster means more sailors coming home sooner. That's all the reward any of us need." The applause that followed was thunderous, but when he returned home that evening, the quiet was deafening. Emma poured him a cup of coffee and asked softly, "Do you ever wish you'd stayed a welder?" He smiled tiredly. "Some days, yes. Back then, the work ended when the whistle blew." He looked at his soot-stained hands. "Now, it never really does." Outside, the night was calm, but beyond the horizon, the war raged on. His invention had become one of the invisible forces driving victory, and yet it had also taken something from him. The simplicity, the solitude, the feeling of ownership. It was gone, replaced by the weight of a legacy still being written. He had built a machine that saved time, but time itself was slipping through his fingers faster than ever. By 1944, the full magnitude of Ted Nelson's achievement had become clear. His welding system was no longer just an industrial trick or a clever shortcut. It was the quiet foundation beneath an empire of steel. From the East Coast to the Pacific, his technology held together the ships that carried America to victory. The numbers were staggering. The Navy calculated that Nelson's process had saved over 50 million man-hours, a figure so vast it was almost impossible to grasp. 50 million hours meant submarines finished months ahead of schedule. 50 million hours meant Liberty ships launched faster than the enemy could sink them. 50 million hours meant time, the one resource that no factory could manufacture and no government could buy, had been reclaimed from waste and turned into strength. At the Mare Island shipyard, the change was visible everywhere. Submarine decks that once required teams of workers sweating for days were now installed in hours. Scaffolding, once the forest of the shipyard, had almost disappeared. Workers no longer crawled through dark spaces to tighten bolts. They now stood on open decks, pressing triggers, each spark a small miracle of precision. In the Kaiser shipyards of Richmond, where the Liberty and Victory ships were born, the effect was even more dramatic. Ships that had taken 3 months to assemble before 1942 could now be completed in less than half that time. At the height of production, America launched 3 new cargo ships every single day. From the air, the yards looked like vast, glowing cities, their cranes and spotlights weaving together a mechanical dance of urgency. And running through it all, invisible but indispensable, was Nelson's invention. Yet the story wasn't only about machines or metal. It was also about people, about the faces behind the sparks. As the war dragged on, more and more men left for the front, and the factories filled with new workers, women, immigrants, teenagers barely out of school. Many had never held a tool before, but with the stud welder, training took hours, not months. Its simplicity gave them confidence. Its efficiency gave them purpose. They called themselves Wendy the Welders, following the spirit of Rosie the Riveter. For the first time, thousands of women joined the heart of heavy industry, helping to build submarines, destroyers, and aircraft carriers. Photographs from that era show rows of women in overalls and headscarves, gripping Nelson guns with steady hands, faces lit by orange light. To them, this wasn't just work. It was a contribution, a declaration that they were part of something far bigger than themselves. Nelson often visited the training bays where these women learned the craft. He watched as instructors shouted commands over the hum of generators. Trigger, lift, next plate. Sparks flared, and the line moved forward, smooth and efficient. He admired their focus, their pride, their precision. Many of them had replaced husbands or brothers who were now at sea, the very sailors whose safety depended on the ships they were helping to build. One day, during a break, a young woman approached him. Her gloves were scorched, her cheeks streaked with soot, but her eyes were bright. "Mr. Nelson," she said, "my brother's on one of these subs. When I weld a deck plate, I like to think maybe it's his." Nelson smiled softly. "Then make it the strongest weld in the yard," he said. Moments like that reminded him that his invention wasn't just about metal and electricity. It was about connection. Every welded stud was a silent promise between builders and those who depended on their work. Each spark represented safety, speed, and a chance for someone to come home. But as his influence spread, so did the industrial pressure. Shipyards demanded more equipment, faster production, endless improvements. The government pushed for even greater efficiency, measuring progress not in human terms but in output, tonnage, deadlines, quotas. Nelson's technology had made those numbers possible, but he sometimes wondered if they were all anyone cared about anymore. Late one night, as he walked through his factory, he paused beside a finished shipment of welding guns stacked neatly on wooden crates. The air was heavy with the smell of oil and ozone. He rested his hand on one of the boxes and thought about how far things had come. 3 years earlier, he'd been dismissed as a dreamer. Now, his idea had become a pillar of American industry. But success had come with an unexpected emptiness, the sense that the more his invention spread, the less it belonged to him. He thought of Emma, who had once worried that he'd lose everything chasing a wild idea. Instead, he'd gain the world, but at the cost of peace. Still, when the war news came in, when headlines celebrated new victories at sea, he felt a quiet pride. Every time he read about a submarine returning safely from patrol or a carrier surviving a typhoon, he knew his work was somewhere inside those steel hulls, holding them together. In May 1944, his factory received its second Army-Navy E Award, this time with a star added to the banner. It meant sustained excellence, months of continuous production without failure. At the ceremony, he stood on a makeshift platform, surrounded by hundreds of workers. The Navy band played, officers saluted, and the workers cheered. Nelson raised his hand to quiet them. 50 million hours, he said simply. That's what we've given back to this country. 50 million hours of time, the one thing no one can replace. Every spark you make saves a little more of it. Every weld brings someone home faster. That's why we do this. The cheers that followed filled the entire yard. It wasn't the sound of victory, not yet, but of gratitude. After the ceremony, he lingered by the river as the crowd dispersed. The water shimmered gold under the setting sun. Somewhere out there, Ships built with his process were crossing oceans, carrying supplies, aircraft, and hope. The thought made him smile, not with triumph, but with peace. He had set out to save time. Somewhere along the way, he'd helped save lives. What Nelson didn't know was that his impact was still growing. The Navy's engineers were adapting his system for new applications, attaching cables, mounting bulkheads, installing machinery. The same tool that had changed shipbuilding was now transforming aircraft factories, bridge construction, and even railcar assembly. The more industries used it, the clearer it became. The war had turned Nelson's welding gun into more than an invention. It had become a symbol of ingenuity, proof that even in chaos, creativity could forge order. And as the war neared its climax, that order would prove more valuable than anyone could have imagined. By the summer of 1945, the constant rumble of war had begun to quiet. The oceans that once swarmed with convoys were calmer now. The shipyards that had worked day and night started to slow. The endless orders, the telegrams marked urgent, the round-the-clock production schedules, all began to fade. The world was changing, and with it, Ted Nelson's purpose. When the announcement finally came, that the fighting was over and peace had returned, the factory floor erupted in cheers. Workers embraced, tossed their gloves in the air, and sang over the sound of still cooling machines. For months, they had dreamed of this moment. For Nelson, however, the news arrived with a quiet, almost unreal stillness. He stepped outside into the sunlight, looked at the sky streaked with faint smoke from the nearby refineries, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: silence. The contracts ended quickly. Military representatives who once visited weekly now sent polite letters of thanks. Orders slowed to a trickle. Within weeks, the roaring heartbeat of the plant became a soft hum. Machines that had run 24 hours a day stood idle, covered in thin layers of dust. The war had made his company indispensable. Peace made it uncertain. One evening, Nelson gathered his senior team in the conference room. The air was heavy with the smell of coffee and metal. "We built a tool for wartime," he began. "Now we need to find what it means in peacetime." His production manager frowned. "Sir, the Navy was 90% of our business. They've cancelled almost every order. What's left?" Nelson leaned back in his chair, eyes thoughtful. The same thing that started all of this, the idea. If it can save time on a ship, it can save time anywhere. He was right. But transforming a wartime invention into a civilian tool wasn't simple. The country was flooded with surplus equipment, and factories everywhere were shifting back to consumer goods. Steel was going to cars and washing machines now, not submarines. And yet, Nelson refused to shut down. Instead, he began to reimagine his device for the world ahead. He traveled across the country, visiting construction firms, bridge builders, and railcar manufacturers. At first, many didn't see the value. "We are done with war tech," one foreman told him in Chicago. "No one needs guns anymore, even welding guns." Nelson just smiled. "You might not need war tools," he replied, "but you'll always need better tools." He demonstrated how his system could attach beams without drilling, fasten panels without bolts, and connect structures faster than ever before. Gradually, engineers and builders began to understand. His technology could reshape peacetime industry just as it had transformed wartime production. By 1946, contracts from civilian companies began to appear, small at first, then growing steadily. His plant reopened under a new name, Nelson Stud Welding Incorporated. The logo featured a spark bursting from a steel plate, a tribute to the invention that had carried him through war and now promised a new beginning. But rebuilding wasn't easy. The country had moved on, and so had many of the people who had helped him. Some workers returned to families far away, others found new jobs in booming consumer industries. The factory that had once employed hundreds now ran with a fraction of its wartime crew. Still, every morning, Nelson walked the floor, greeting the workers by name, checking the machines, adjusting designs. Emma often joined him, bringing lunch and company. She noticed how he lingered by the older tools, touching them like old friends. "You miss it, don't you?" she asked one day. "The noise," he said with a faint smile. "Sometimes, but mostly the purpose." In peacetime, everything felt slower. There were no deadlines measured in lives, no telegrams that made your hand shake. Yet, there was also peace, the kind he hadn't realized he'd been longing for. As industries adapted, Nelson's process found new homes. The automotive sector discovered that his welding method could secure car frames faster than bolts. Bridge engineers used it to connect structural steel safely and efficiently. Even the burgeoning power and energy industries began using his technique to build plants, refineries, and towers. The same principle that had once built warships now built the foundations of post-war America. By 1948, Nelson's company had regained stability. It wasn't the furious growth of wartime, but it was steady, sustainable. His invention had survived the transition from war to peace, proving that innovation didn't belong to one era. It belonged to every hand that chose to improve something. Still, there were moments when nostalgia crept in. At reunions with former shipyard workers, he listened to stories of those years, the long nights, the noise, the shared sense of mission. People spoke of it like a memory of another lifetime. It was hard, one welder said, but it mattered. Every spark meant something. Nelson understood. Those sparks had built more than ships. They had built belief. Belief in ingenuity, in teamwork, in the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when the world demanded it. One evening, he received a letter from the Navy Department. Inside was a small, neatly folded document titled Recognition of Service and Contribution to Naval Engineering. It was signed by the Secretary of the Navy himself. The letter thanked him for his invention, noting that it had significantly increased the operational readiness of the United States fleet and set a standard of innovation that will guide naval construction for decades to come. He read it twice, then set it down quietly. Emma found him later, still looking at the letter. "You finally got your credit," she said. He smiled. It was never about credit. I just wanted them to listen. That night, he walked outside and looked up at the stars, small sparks scattered across the vast dark sky. They reminded him of the welding arcs from his factory, thousands of tiny bursts of light, each one marking a step forward. Peace had taken away the urgency but left something deeper, reflection. He began to give talks at universities and engineering societies, speaking not about war, but about creativity, perseverance, and the power of practical invention. Great ideas, he told students, don't always start in laboratories. Sometimes they start with frustration, a worker thinking, there must be a better way. The audiences loved him, not for his fame, but for his humility. He spoke like someone who had spent his life on the factory floor, not behind a desk. His lessons were simple, honest, and human. As the 1950s approached, his invention continued to spread quietly across the world. The stud welding system became a global standard, used in construction, shipbuilding, and manufacturing from Europe to Japan. The spark that began in a California garage now links cities, bridges, and industries across continents. And through it all, Nelson remained the same, modest, patient, quietly proud. He had built something that lasted, not a monument or a headline, but a legacy of usefulness. The war had shown him what invention could do in desperate times. Peace showed him what it could mean in lasting ones. By the time the 1950s gave way to a new decade, Ted Nelson's invention had become so common that few even thought about where it came from. The stud welding gun was everywhere, in shipyards, factories, skyscrapers, and bridges. It was used to assemble power plants, locomotives, and oil rigs, its distinctive crackle of light a familiar rhythm in the soundtrack of modern industry. Nelson never sought fame, but his name quietly endured among engineers. His process became standard in construction manuals, and his patents were cited by the next generation of inventors. The man who once welded in a dim corner of Mare Island had changed the language of building itself, replacing the sound of hammer and rivet with the hiss of electricity and spark. In 1962, he was invited to a ceremony in Washington, D.C., where a new naval research facility displayed a massive wall chart of the great advances in maritime engineering. His invention was there, near the top, under the simple heading, Stud Welding, 1941. He stood quietly among admirals and scientists, hands folded behind his back. When a young engineer asked if he was proud, Nelson smiled. "I'm proud it works," he said. "Everything else is paperwork." He returned home to California and spent more time at his plant, though the business no longer needed him every day. Younger managers handled operations, engineers refined his designs, and new technologies built on his foundation. He often walked the production floor slowly, listening to the faint rhythm of welding guns firing in sequence. Each spark, each brief flare of light, felt like a heartbeat of progress, steady, timeless. Emma, always his anchor, encouraged him to rest, but he rarely did. "You've earned it," she told him. "You've given the world enough metal and sparks to last a century." He smiled softly. "Maybe. But every time I hear that sound, I remember why I started. I wanted to make work easier, not harder. I think we did that." Over the years, invitations continued to arrive. Universities asking him to speak, companies wanting to license his newer patents, professional societies offering awards. He accepted some, declined others, but always carried the same message, that innovation wasn't about brilliance, but persistence. "You don't have to invent something new," he told an audience at Purdue. "You just have to look at what exists and ask, why not better?" He often ended his talks with the same story, the night he first tested his prototype in 1941. How the sparks had jumped unpredictably, how the first stud failed, then the second, until finally, the third held. That one spark, he'd say, was the start of everything. Not because it worked, but because I didn't stop when it didn't. In the decades that followed, his invention continued to evolve. By the 1970s, automated stud welding machines were operating in shipyards around the world. By the 1980s, robotic arms in automotive plants were using the same principle he had discovered by hand. Even spacecraft assemblies borrowed from his process, using high-precision arc systems to fasten components in conditions no human welder could survive. The stud gun had become more than a tool. It was an idea that outgrew its creator. And Nelson, more than anyone, seemed content with that. When he finally retired, he and Emma moved to a small house overlooking the bay. From his porch, he could see the distant silhouettes of ships, tankers, cargo vessels, and Navy cruisers passing slowly across the horizon. Many of them, he knew, were still held together by his method. Sometimes, at sunset, he'd watch as their lights flickered against the water. To anyone else, it looked like reflection. To him, it looked like sparks, reminders of every moment that had led here, every idea born from persistence, every challenge met with one more attempt. Visitors occasionally came, engineers, historians, journalists. They always asked the same question: what did he think his legacy was? He would pause, gaze toward the horizon, and answer quietly, "I think it's proof that one person's frustration can become everyone's progress." He believed deeply in the idea that invention wasn't the domain of genius, but of patience. That every improvement, no matter how small, shaped the world a little better. Progress, he once said, isn't a race toward the future. It's a conversation with the present. When he passed his company fully to a new generation of engineers, he wrote a simple note to hang in the main office. "Every spark matters. Each one is a thought, a risk, a moment of trying again. Treat it that way." That note stayed there for decades. Even as the factory modernized, even as digital systems replaced paper and robots replaced men, the words remained, a reminder that behind every innovation was a human story. In the years that followed, his influence quietly spread beyond engineering. Historians studying wartime production pointed to Nelson's work as an example of how creativity could triumph over procedure, how a single idea could reshape an entire industry. His invention had not only built ships, it had built belief in the power of human ingenuity. Today, his process is still used in nearly every major construction project on Earth, from bridges spanning continents to skyscrapers piercing the clouds. Every flash of light that bursts from a welding gun carries a piece of the same energy he once held in his hands, the energy of possibility. And though time has passed, his story continues to echo in the hum of factories and the glow of metal being joined. Because, in the end, Ted Nelson didn't just change how things were built. He changed how people thought about building. The war had demanded speed. He gave it precision. The world had demanded results. He gave it innovation. But most of all, he gave it proof that greatness can begin not in power or privilege, but in a single spark and the refusal to let it fade. As the light of evening fell over the bay and the last ship of the day disappeared beyond the horizon, the air grew still. Somewhere far away, in a workshop, another welder pulled a trigger, and a flash of light illuminated the steel. Just for a moment, the world glowed, and in that glow lived the legacy of a man who believed that even the smallest idea, when carried by conviction, could ignite a revolution.